Whitebeard and Garp are considered to be weaker than Roger. I've done multiple polls on this channel about this topic, and Roger has always won by a considerable margin. Yet, what if the masses were actually wrong? What if, of the trio of Whitebeard, Garp and Roger, Roger was actually the weakest? There is actually evidence in the story that suggests that Whitebeard and Garp both achieved strength greater than even the Pirate King. This video will compare both of these characters to Roger in their prime, to decide who of them was the strongest. And the character we're going to start with is the second most infamous pirate in the story, Edward Newgate. Perhaps the biggest potential piece of evidence for Whitebeard being stronger than Roger is his title, the strongest man in the world. We'll next discuss what it actually means that Whitebeard had this title. What is extremely important to bring up is that this is a title Whitebeard already had in the time when Roger was alive. This information comes from the Weaver card databook, where both Whitebeard's older and younger cards refer to him as the strongest man. For disclosure, the Weaver card databooks are as canon as any One Piece material can get outside the actual volumes. This is because they are actually credited as being authored by Eiichiro Oda. This is a credit that is very rare among One Piece products. For example, all the One Piece movies, games and even the anime are only credited as being based on the works of Eiichiro Oda. Outside the manga, only a select few things like Chapter 0, the Ace novels, and the Weaver cards are actually authored by Oda. Oda has also personally said in the SBS of Volume 91 that this extra content is part of the story. We've also seen that this works in practice, where for example, Jinbei's post-time skip bounty was first revealed in his Weaver card, before it was later shown in the manga. If the Weaver cards are indeed canon, would Whitebeard possessing this title when Roger was alive then confirm that Whitebeard actually was stronger than Roger? Let's explore a bit deeper. A frequent theme in One Piece is actually that titles are not always 100% accurate. A lot of them are in fact inaccurate, because of things like misinformation and propaganda. As a very simple example, Kuma is known throughout the world as the Tyrant. Kuma's title is however only a lie perpetuated by King Pekori, as retribution for Kuma overthrowing him. The fact that all titles aren't always accurate arguably only makes the One Piece story more compelling. Misleading titles are something that occur in real life, just as they do in fiction. The best known real life example of this is probably Napoleon, who was known as the Little Corporal, despite being a man of average height in 19th century France. However, there is one major thing that stands out about Whitebeard's title. While his Weaver card refers to him as the world's strongest man, this is clearly just a moniker. For example, Usopp in his Weaver card is also referred to as God in this exact same manner. What is however very interesting is that on the other side of Whitebeard's card, he is referred to by a different title. The card says that Kosuke Oden was recruited by Sekai Saikyo no Daikaisoku, which means the world's strongest great pirate. What is of note however is that this is not just a quoted title, like the world's strongest man, but actual text describing Whitebeard. Yet, even this does not necessarily mean that Whitebeard being the strongest is accurate. Even in other cases in the story, titles that have been presented like this have turned out to not be true. The most notable example of this are the Five Elders, who have the title, the highest authority in the world government. This is not only their moniker, but something the story presents multiple times as just being fact. This also extends to side material, where in One Piece Yellow Grand Elements, a databook that is once again giving the rare author credit of Eiichiro Oda, the Elders are verbatim described as the highest authority in the world government, just like Whitebeard was referred to as the strongest great pirate. Naturally, readers who have read further into the story know that the Gorosei's title of being the highest authority in the world government is actually false, as their authority is superseded by Imu, the actual king of the world. The moral of the story is, no matter how they are presented, titles in One Piece have always been unreliable. In the case of Whitebeard, even though he is referred to as the strongest man in the world, or as the strongest great pirate in a time when Roger was alive, this is not a confirmation that he was stronger than Roger. At the same time, however, it also does not confirm that he wasn't stronger than Roger. Whitebeard had to get his reputation as the strongest from somewhere. While not necessarily fact, him still being known by the world as the strongest in the same era when Roger was fighting monsters like Garp and Shiki speaks volumes about Whitebeard's strength. There's even a possible hint at Whitebeard's fame superseding Roger's in the past, where in chapter 964, Shanks and Bucky are seen being annoyed at all the attention the world is giving Whitebeard, in an era when Roger was still active. To determine if Whitebeard's title of being the strongest pirate was actually accurate, the video will next analyze what we actually know about both Roger and Whitebeard's power, when they were both still alive. A natural place to start is with the fight we saw between these two characters during the Oden flashback. The most notable feat here is probably the Conqueror's Haki clash between Roger and Whitebeard, which split the skies and shook the entire island. Despite what some fans may think, splitting the skies does not mean that both of these characters were on an equal level. When Luffy and Kaido had a similar class of Conqueror's Haki during the Wano arc, they also split the skies. Luffy was however still significantly weaker than Kaido at this point in time, and this was still several chapters before Luffy had even awakened his Devil Fruit. An important thing to note is that a class of Conqueror's Haki is also just a feat of the character's aptitude with Conqueror's Haki, and does not take into account other abilities, such as Devil Fruit powers or physical strength. In other words, this clash between Roger and Whitebeard only tells us that both of their Conqueror's Haki was very strong, and at a level where it can't overwhelm the other, and the clash can't actually be used as evidence for either of them being stronger than the other. After this clash, Whitebeard and Roger actually went into a prolonged battle with both of their crews, that lasted for 3 whole days. While the battle was inconclusive, with no definitive victor, there is an actual argument that this battle made Whitebeard look more impressive than it did Roger. This is because, if we exclude the captains, the Roger pirates as a whole were very likely far stronger than the Whitebeard pirates at this point in time. Whitebeard's crew at this point was much younger and more inexperienced than the Roger pirates, who had already been active for years before the Whitebeard pirates even existed. There is also an argument that Whitebeard's followers never achieved the strength Roger's followers did. For example, Silver's Rayleigh, the vice captain of the Roger pirates, believes that he could have possibly beaten an emperor of the sea in his younger days. It is also likely that Rayleigh is not exaggerating, as he is by nature very humble, and says this in reference to him no longer being at that level as an old man. This would be in contrast to someone like Marco, who was still a teenager when fighting the Roger pirates. Marco, even in the present story, is someone who struggles with the Yonko and Navy admirals, and it is likely that he is far stronger now than over 20 years in the past. One big counter-argument in favor of the Whitebeard pirates being able to match the Roger pirates in the past is that Kosuke Oden was still a part of the crew at this point in time. However, even though Oden is very strong, it is very debatable if he alone was enough to overcome the difference between the two crews when excluding the captains. For example, even if Oden managed to occupy someone like Rayleigh, that would still leave the other inexperienced Whitebeard pirates against the battle-hardened veterans of the Roger pirates. If you think Oden was genuinely strong enough to essentially carry Whitebeard's entire crew, you're free to do so, but I personally find it rather hard to believe. If we are to assume that Roger's followers at this point in time were as a whole much stronger than Whitebeard's, it could be evidence that Whitebeard himself was the strongest person on the island at this time, and that he was the reason why the battle lasted for 3 days, without either side coming out on top. Still, even this is not that strong of an indicator. One big reason for this is just the fact that the battle lasted for 3 days, without either side being defeated. Characters in One Piece weaker than Roger and Whitebeard have fought for longer periods of time than this, and it's possible that either pirate crew would have definitively won had the battle continued. Furthermore, there's an argument that neither crew was taking this engagement particularly seriously. While rivals, Roger and Whitebeard had a lot of respect for one another, and Whitebeard was even among the few people Roger wanted to visit before his eventual death. Then there is also the fact that Roger came into this battle with the desire to meet and talk to Kosuke Oden, which would be rather difficult if the Roger pirates had actually tried to kill the Whitebeard pirates. One last thing to point out about this battle is that it is in a period of time when Roger was already sick, and Crocus said he only had a year left to live. While some fans claim that Roger's illness did not affect his strength, this is completely false. This claim comes from an interpretation of a scene in Chapter 0, where Bucky asks Crocus if Roger is able to fight because of his illness, to which Roger says that Roger is in perfect condition. This is entirely different from the illness not affecting Roger in the slightest. and this scene actually proves that the illness did affect Roger's fighting ability. It wouldn't make sense for Bucky to ask Crocus about Roger's condition if the illness had no effect on him. Crocus's answer also only means that Roger on that day was in good condition. Like many long-term illnesses in real life, there are good days and there are bad days. When Rayleigh describes Roger's illness, he says that Roger was in a lot of pain, and that Crocus only managed to lessen the pain enough for Roger to complete his final voyage. To further prove that the illness did affect Roger's day-to-day life, right before he heads for Laugh-Tale, Roger is seen coughing and wheezing. If Roger already had symptoms like this on a regular day, one can only imagine how negatively the illness would affect him when he's physically exerting himself in a fight. This illness admittedly makes gauging Roger's prime as a fighter very difficult. It's hard to say whether Roger was actually in his prime during his last fight with Whitebeard. Roger at this point had already had the illness for years, and it could be that his best days were behind him. Alternatively, it's possible that Roger kept growing stronger during his illness, and was actually at his peak during the fight with Whitebeard, despite its effects. The story has examples of this kind of growth, where for example, Shanks, even after losing his left arm to the Lord of the Coast, managed to quadruple his bounty and become a Yonko in the years following his maiming. I won't stay too long on this point, however, as there's genuinely no way to tell at what period Roger was at his strongest, based on what we know from the story. The video has so far brought up two major arguments as to why Whitebeard could have been stronger than Roger when he was alive. The first is that Whitebeard was literally known as the strongest man in the world, and the strongest great pirate in the world at this time. The second is that the Whitebeard pirates were somehow able to have a 3-day-long battle with the Roger pirates, despite Roger at the time likely having a far stronger crew than Whitebeard. However, both of these points have their caveats. The first is that titles in One Piece have a history of being inaccurate. Whitebeard's title being stated in plain text also does not change this, as other similar cases in the series have also been proven to be inaccurate. Whitebeard's last battle with Roger also has several things to note, such as the presence of Kozuki Oden, the fight likely not being that serious, and Roger during this fight being in the last stages of his illness. Even though this might sound like the analysis is leaning towards Roger being the stronger of the two, there is one last very important piece of evidence that could suggest that Whitebeard actually surpassed Roger in his prime. Before I reveal what this is though, I first need to analyze the other character this video is about. Just like with Whitebeard, most fans seemingly think that Garp in his prime was weaker than Roger. Regardless of fan opinion, however, it is very hard to argue that Garp was not someone very close to Roger's level. Garp's reputation around the world is that he managed to corner Roger several times in the past. What is very interesting is that this claim does not come from just the people, but from Roger himself. Right before his execution, Roger quite literally tells Garp that the two of them almost killed each other several times. This is arguably the single biggest statement of any one character's strength in the entire story. While the series is full of quotes relating to Roger and his strength, this is the only moment in the story where Roger himself directly says that another character was on his level. It is also very unlikely that Roger is lying here. The context of the scene is him asking Garp to take care of Ace. As Garp is a very honest and straightforward person, Roger buttering Garp up by exaggerating his strength would probably not work. Just to make it crystal clear, the translation of Roger saying that Garp almost killed him multiple times is also 100% accurate. The original Japanese of what Roger said is, "Ore to omae wa nanchū kai to koroshiai yoshita nakadaro," which means, "You and I have almost killed each other dozens of times." This one sentence about Garp having almost killed Roger dozens of times has some pretty crazy implications. For one, we've never heard of any of Roger's other rivals, be it Whitebeard, Sebek, or Shiki, bringing Roger near death. Even crazier, however, is the possible context of Garp's fights with Roger. As brought up before, Roger always had a crew of elites with him, and we also know that someone like Rayleigh was with Roger since both of them were very young. This is compared to Garp, who is only a vice admiral, and has never in the story had any subordinates of note. From what we've seen, when Garp goes on missions in the story, he only has his one ship full of low-ranking marines with him. Garp's lack of manpower is demonstrated during the Egghead arc, where he asked Sword for help in rescuing Kobe. and even then only received Marines ranked Rear Admiral and lower. Garp's only direct subordinate we know by name is Bogart, and he likely also isn't that strong, as he was also with Garp when he rescued Kobe, and we did not see him contribute to the mission in any way. Even though the idea is crazy, these are the facts. Garp almost always goes on missions without any strong allies with him. Roger when he was alive is almost never seen without his crew. Roger still said that Garp almost killed him dozens of times. In my mind, there's no other way to honestly interpret the story than that Garp was actually strong enough to at least a few times almost kill Roger by himself, when the other Roger pirates were also around. As impressive as this makes Garp look, there is still something to consider before any of you go and declare him the strongest in One Piece. This is Garp's reputation. Despite clearly being extremely strong, people in the One Piece world do not refer to Garp in the same way they refer to Roger and Whitebeard. Even though they're from the same era, Garp has never been called the strongest man in the world like Whitebeard was. People also never speak about Garp's strength in the same grandiose way they talk about Roger. When Kaido tells Luffy that Haki eclipses everything, he uses Roger as his example instead of Garp, even though it's all but confirmed that the latter also does not have a devil fruit ability. This is actually a frequent theme in the story, where even people who've had personal experiences with Garp do not refer to him as the strongest of his era. When Bucky talks about Whitebeard, he says that he was the only man who managed to fight on equal footing with Roger. Jin Chao, who viewed Garp as the devil himself, still thought that Roger was the greatest of his era, and even that Roger's blood held more power than Garp's blood. Shiki also thought that the idea of Marines actually capturing Roger was laughable. One could rightfully argue that, as pirates, all these characters would have a bias towards a Marine like Garp. However, even Sengoku, who is seemingly Garp's best friend, thought that Roxy Zebek might have been Roger's greatest foe over him. During Marineford, Sengoku also calls Whitebeard by his title, the world's strongest man. If you really want to push this idea, there's also a quote from Garp himself that could be interpreted as him viewing himself as weaker than Whitebeard. This is when he talks to Ace in Impel Down before the Summit War, and says that in angering Whitebeard, they've angered the King of the Seas. This is admittedly a pretty big conundrum. On the one hand, most things in the story seem to point to Garp being weaker than both Roger and Whitebeard. On the other hand, that single quote from Roger saying that Garp almost killed him dozens of times is better than any of the other claims about characters rivaling Roger, as it comes from Roger himself. My own conclusion, taking into account all the evidence presented in this video, is that it's still very hard to tell who actually was the strongest of Roger, Whitebeard and Garp when all three were alive. However, what is more clear is that, in the One Piece world, the man who is seen as the strongest by the people appears to be Roger. I went over this more in my previous video, but despite Whitebeard's title, there are simply way more moments in the story where characters refer to Roger as the strongest of his era than with any of the other characters. Still, Whitebeard and Garp have one more card to play in this debate. Let's say that the people of the One Piece world are correct, and Roger when he was alive was stronger than both Garp and Whitebeard. There is still a possibility that Garp and Whitebeard surpassed Roger after his death. Both of them were in their 50s when Roger died, but despite what some of you may think, One Piece characters can still grow even at this age. An example of this would be someone like Ashura Doji, who's 56 by the time of the Wano arc, yet says that the last 20 years of his life have only made him stronger. From every case we've seen in the story, only characters who are 70 and older have noted about how old age has made them weaker. This would mean that Garp and Whitebeard might have still both had years of growth left, even after Roger's death. We also know that, after Roger's execution, Garp and Whitebeard did not retire, and still frequently took part in combat. As a Yonko, and the world's most infamous pirate after Roger's death, Whitebeard was a constant target of people trying to claim his head, and the number of these people probably only increased with the Great Pirate Era. According to Crocodile, the world is actually full of pirates who failed to kill Whitebeard, and many of them were apparently strong enough to end up in level 6 of Impel Down. While readers may think that, because Whitebeard never wanted to be the Pirate King, it also means that he didn't have the same drive to become the strongest, like for example Luffy. This is however more than likely not true. As a Yonko, Whitebeard had thousands of followers and a number of territories looking to him for protection. We also know that Whitebeard put all the loot he gained as a pirate back into supporting his home island of Sphinx. To protect his family and the people who relied on him, Whitebeard had huge motivation to be as strong as he possibly could. We also see that Whitebeard is very proud of his strength, when he is insulted when the marines in the summit war think they can kill him. Like Whitebeard, Garp also had similar obligations to maintain his strength after Roger's execution, where he remained in active duty in the marines. In fact, we know that Garp had a very big fight only a few days before Roger's execution, when him and Sengoku had to fight Shiki at Marineford. Roger's death also likely made the government rely a lot more on Garp, as Roger's final words led to a mass influx of pirates in the world. As Garp detests pirates, he also was likely very willing to combat this new threat. This was also still a period of time when the likes of Sakazuki, Borsalino and Kusan were not yet admirals, and were still rising through the ranks. We also know that Garp in this time also frequently trained with Kusan, and Brand New even comments that Garp's training was a central part of what made him so strong. As brought up before in this video, while there's an argument that Roger might have been the strongest when him, Garp and Whitebeard were still alive, the three were still probably very close to each other in strength. It would therefore be not at all unlikely that Garp and Whitebeard both managed to surpass Roger's strength in the years after his death, before they got too old. This would also not contradict Roger's worldwide reputation as the strongest of the trio even in the present day, as the public is clearly not aware of how strong Garp and Whitebeard could have gotten through simply training. I'm personally still open to the idea of Roger being the strongest of the trio, but from trying to read the facts of the story as honestly as I can, I genuinely think the evidence is pointing towards both Garp and Whitebeard in the end surpassing Roger. Before I end the video, I would like to mention that I'm aware that there's a fan claim that Whitebeard reached his prime in his 30s. From my research, this is completely false. The source for this claim is apparently One Piece magazine volume 9. There is however no such claim in the original Japanese magazine that I can find. Furthermore, the One Piece magazine is actually not authored by Oda, and is by and large not canon. When the magazine actually does present canon material, such as devil fruit designs, they make a clear citation to Oda. In the future, I would like to make a more thorough breakdown what actually constitutes the One Piece canon, but I'm fairly booked for the post-Egghead and Elbaf related videos for the near future. If you enjoyed this video, you should definitely subscribe, so that you won't miss out on any of my future content. And finally, thanks a lot for watching this video to the end.